Commander Zixathara stood before the massive viewing screen on her flagship and watched the small blue planet rotating slowly in the darkness of space. Earth, they called it, this tiny world at the edge of nowhere that had somehow caught the attention of the mighty Kelhari Empire. She flexed her forearms and adjusted her ceremonial armor as she studied the tactical reports floating in holographic displays around her command chair. The data was almost laughable. These humans had been fighting wars among themselves for thousands of their years, yet their technology remained primitive by galactic standards. Their fastest ships could barely reach 1/10 the speed of her slowest scout vessel. Their weapons were crude projectile throwers and simple energy beams that would barely scratch the paint on a Kelhari destroyer. Their military organization seemed chaotic, with dozens of different nations, each maintaining separate armed forces that rarely worked together effectively. Zixathara had conquered 47 worlds for the Empire during her long career as a fleet commander. She had seen species with crystalline exoskeletons that could deflect plasma fire and beings who could manipulate gravity itself as a weapon. She had faced hive minds that coordinated millions of warriors with perfect precision and ancient civilizations that had mastered technologies the Kelhari were still trying to understand. Yet every single one of those mighty species had eventually bowed before the overwhelming power of the Imperial fleet. These humans would be no different. If anything, they would be easier to defeat than most. Their ships were scattered across their solar system with no unified command structure. Their weapons technology was centuries behind galactic standard. Most importantly, they had never faced an enemy from beyond their own world, which meant they had no idea what real warfare looked like when conducted between starfaring civilizations. Captain Jake Morrison received the transmission at exactly 1400 hours ship time while his vessel orbited the dark side of Earth's moon. The message came through on all frequencies simultaneously, and the computer systems automatically translated the alien words into clear English. The voice was cold and mechanical, with an undertone that suggested vast power held barely in check. Morrison was a veteran of the Mars Colony Wars and had served in the asteroid mining conflicts that had raged through the outer system for the past decade. He had seen combat in the zero-gravity environments around Jupiter's moons and had led boarding actions against pirate vessels hiding in the belt. He thought he understood what war meant and what it cost in blood and treasure and human lives. The alien message was simple and direct. The Kelhari Empire claimed this solar system by right of conquest. All human military forces were to surrender immediately and prepare for integration into the imperial structure. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force and complete annihilation. Humanity had exactly 48 hours to respond with unconditional surrender. Morrison looked around the bridge of his ship at the faces of his crew. Lieutenant Amy Carter sat at the communications station with her hands frozen over the controls as she tried to process what she had just heard. The tactical officer bent over his displays, calculating the impossible odds they were facing. The navigation officer stared out at the stars as if seeing them for the first time. Through the main view screen, Morrison could see the alien fleet hanging in space like a collection of deadly jewels. The ships were beautiful in their own terrible way, with smooth curves and gleaming surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. Each vessel was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and the energy readings his sensors detected suggested weapons powerful enough to crack planets. Morrison had trained for many scenarios during his military career, but alien invasion had never been one of them. The possibility had existed in theory, but most military planners assumed that any species capable of interstellar travel would either be peaceful explorers or so advanced that resistance would be meaningless. No one had seriously planned for a situation where humanity might actually have to fight for its survival against beings from another world. Zixathara reviewed the human response patterns with clinical interest. Instead of the immediate surrender, she expected the humans were frantically repositioning their scattered forces. Ships that had been conducting routine patrols or cargo runs were converging on strategic positions throughout their solar system. Communication traffic between their various military installations had increased by several 100% as they attempted to coordinate some kind of defense. It was almost amusing to watch. The humans seemed to believe they could mount meaningful resistance against a force that had crushed civilizations 1,000 times more advanced than their own. They were arranging their primitive vessels in formations that might have been effective against other humans, but would be utterly useless against Kelhari technology and tactics. Still, there was something in their response that gave Zixathara a moment of pause. Most species, when faced with overwhelming odds, would at least attempt to negotiate or seek some kind of compromise that might allow their civilization to survive in some form. These humans showed no sign of even considering such options. They were preparing to fight against impossible odds with what appeared to be grim determination rather than panic or despair. Morrison stood up from his command chair and walked to the view screen where he could see Earth hanging blue and beautiful in the void. Somewhere down there were 8 billion human beings who had just learned they were no longer alone in the universe and that their new neighbors had come not in peace, but in conquest. He turned back to his crew and saw something in their faces that he recognized from a dozen battlefields. It was the look of soldiers who knew they were outgunned and outnumbered, but were going to fight anyway, because that was what soldiers did when everything they cared about was threatened. The battle began exactly as Zixathara had predicted it would. Her advanced warships opened fire from maximum range with weapons that could vaporize mountains, and the primitive human vessels responded with their crude projectile weapons and simple energy beams. The results were predictably one-sided, as Kelhari shields absorbed the pathetic human attacks without even flickering while return fire tore through human hulls like paper. Within the first hour of combat, Zixathara watched 30% of the human fleet simply cease to exist. Ships that had taken years to build and represented the pinnacle of human engineering were reduced to expanding clouds of debris and superheated gas. Any rational species would have surrendered immediately when faced with such overwhelming technological superiority. But the humans did not surrender. Instead, they did something that Zixathara had never witnessed in her 40 cycles of military service. They began to adapt their tactics in real time while under fire and taking massive casualties. Rather than retreating or attempting to negotiate, they started changing their entire approach to the battle based on what they were learning about Kelhari capabilities. Commander Lisa Hayes watched her weapons officer shake his head in frustration as another full spread of missiles detonated harmlessly against alien shield generators. The enemy vessels hung in space like untouchable gods, raining destruction down on her squadron while seeming to take no damage in return. Her tactical displays showed friendly contacts disappearing one by one as ships she had served alongside for years were wiped from existence. Hayes had commanded the destroyer Defiance through 3 separate conflicts in the outer system and had never lost a ship under her command. She understood space combat better than almost anyone in the human fleet, and she knew that conventional tactics were useless against this enemy. If they were going to survive the next hour, they needed to try something completely different. She turned to her navigation officer and gave an order that made her entire bridge crew stare at her in shock. She wanted him to plot a course that would take them directly toward the nearest Kelhari cruiser at maximum acceleration. When her tactical officer protested that such a course was suicide, Hayes simply smiled and told him that their current tactics were also suicide, but slower and less useful. The Defiance dove toward the alien vessel like a missile aimed at the heart of enemy formation. Kelhari weapons tracked the small human ship and filled the space around it with deadly energy, but Hayes had learned something important during the first phase of the battle. The alien weapons were incredibly powerful, but they seemed designed for long-range combat against targets that fought in predictable patterns. At close range, where her ship could change direction rapidly and randomly, the alien targeting systems had trouble maintaining effective fire solutions. It was still dangerous beyond description, but it was possible to survive long enough to try something desperate. Hayes brought her ship to point-blank range with the Kelhari cruiser and ordered all weapons to concentrate fire on a single small section of the enemy shield grid. Zixathara watched in disbelief as the concentrated human fire created a momentary fluctuation in the shield matrix of one of her cruisers. The weakness lasted only seconds before automatic systems compensated and restored full protection. But in that brief window, the human ship managed to put several solid hits directly on the cruiser hull. The damage was minimal, but the fact that it happened at all was impossible according to everything Zixathara knew about shield technology. The shield weakness the humans had discovered and exploited was a closely guarded military secret, known only to the highest levels of Kelhari command. It was a fundamental flaw in the design that most species took years of careful study and experimentation to identify. These humans had figured it out during their first hour of combat while taking devastating losses and fighting for their lives. Captain Morrison coordinated the human response from his flagship as he watched Hayes demonstrate that the enemy could be hurt. He immediately transmitted new tactical instructions to every surviving ship in the fleet, telling them to follow the Defiance example. Get in close where alien weapons were less effective and concentrate all fire on single points in the enemy. Shield grid. The change in human tactics was dramatic and immediate. Ships that had been hanging back trying to fight at long range suddenly accelerated toward the alien fleet in what appeared to be suicide runs. But instead of ramming attacks, they were conducting close-range gunnery duels that somehow allowed their inferior weapons to actually damage enemy vessels. Morrison watched his tactical displays as human ships began scoring hits against targets that had seemed untouchable just minutes before. The casualties were still terrible and his fleet was still outnumbered and outgunned, but for the first time since the battle began, he felt something that might have been hope. The aliens could be hurt, and that meant they could be beaten. Lieutenant Amy Carter worked frantically at her communications station trying to coordinate the new tactics across the scattered human forces. The alien jamming was making normal communication almost impossible, but she found that old-fashioned tight beam transmissions could still get through if she was creative about routing and frequency selection. She had trained as a communications specialist, but had never imagined she would be trying to coordinate desperate military tactics while under fire from beings from another world. Zixathara felt something she had not experienced in decades of military service. Uncertainty. These humans were not behaving like any species she had ever encountered. They were learning too fast and adapting too quickly, and refusing to break even when facing odds that should have shattered their morale completely. Her tactical officer reported that 3 more cruisers had suffered hull damage from human attacks. The damage was still relatively minor, but it was increasing as the humans refined their close combat techniques. More disturbing was the fact that human ships were beginning to work together in small groups that seemed to coordinate their attacks without any apparent communication between them. The humans were developing pack tactics in real time while under fire. Small groups of their ships would approach different alien vessels, simultaneously forcing the Kelhari gunners to divide their attention between multiple threats. While the aliens engaged, one group another would close to point-blank range and concentrate fire on shield weak points that the first group had identified through trial and error. Morrison realized that his fleet was evolving during the battle itself. Ships that had never worked together before were forming spontaneous tactical partnerships based on nothing more than shared desperation and the will to survive. Captains who had spent their careers following rigid military protocols were throwing out the rule book and improvising new forms of combat that took advantage of human strengths while minimizing their technological weaknesses. The battle that should have lasted minutes was stretching into hours as human resistance not only continued but actually seemed to be growing more effective. Zixthara found herself in the unprecedented position of calling for additional tactical analysis of an enemy she had expected to crush without effort. For the first time in her military career, she was facing an opponent that refused to behave according to established patterns of civilized warfare. 3 days into what should have been a one-day conquest, Zixthara found herself genuinely concerned for the first time in her long military career. The humans had not only survived the initial assault, but had begun employing tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare she had ever learned. They seemed to have no respect for established military protocol and were willing to try things that no rational species would ever attempt. Major Steve Collins led his boarding party through the twisted wreckage of a disabled Kelhari destroyer that his ship had managed to cripple during the previous day fighting. Instead of following standard boarding procedures and attempting to secure the main airlocks, Collins had ordered his Marines to cut their way into the ship through maintenance hatches and emergency access ports scattered throughout the hull. Result was that instead of facing a concentrated defensive force at predictable entry points, the Kelhari crew found themselves dealing with small groups of human soldiers appearing simultaneously throughout their vessel. Collins had studied the alien ship designs captured during earlier battles and had identified dozens of weak points in their internal security arrangements that could be exploited by troops willing to take extreme risks. Collins moved through the alien corridors with his assault rifle ready and his demolitions pack secured to his back. He had fought in the tunnel systems beneath the Martian surface and in the cramped confines of asteroid mining stations where every battle was close quarters and personal. The alien ship was just another confined space that needed to be cleared of hostiles using whatever methods worked. Sergeant Kate Williams followed close behind Collins with her own specialized equipment designed for breaching operations in space-based facilities. When they encountered a locked blast door that her electronic tools could not hack, she simply attached a shaped charge to the alien metal and blew a hole large enough for the squad to pass through. She had learned her trade in the mining fields, where explosives were tools for reshaping reality rather than weapons of war. The Kelhari crew had never faced boarding tactics like this. Most civilized species would attempt to capture a disabled enemy vessel intact so that its technology could be studied and reverse-engineered. The humans seemed completely uninterested in preserving anything they found and were systematically destroying every system they encountered, whether it was militarily significant or not. Williams planted charges throughout the ship's critical systems, with the casual efficiency of someone who had spent years blasting ore from asteroid faces. She was not trying to disable the ship so it could be repaired and used later. She was gutting it from the inside and turning it into an expanding cloud of scrap metal that would never threaten anyone again. Zixthara watched her fleet strength diminish not through superior enemy firepower, but through sheer human persistence and willingness to absorb casualties that would have broken any other species' morale. Her tactical displays showed a dozen Kelhari vessels either destroyed or so badly damaged they had to be withdrawn from combat. The humans were achieving these results despite having inferior technology and taking losses at a rate that should have ended their resistance days ago. Dr. Rachel Martinez worked around the clock in her laboratory aboard the human command ship studying pieces of alien technology that boarding parties and salvage teams had retrieved from destroyed Kelhari vessels. Unlike other species who would spend months carefully analyzing new technology before attempting to integrate it into their own systems, Martinez was immediately beginning to jury-rig human equipment with alien components. Her approach was completely unscientific by galactic standards. Instead of trying to understand the underlying principles behind Kelhari technology, she was simply connecting alien devices to human systems and seeing what happened. Most of her experiments failed catastrophically, but the few that worked were immediately transmitted to human ships throughout the fleet. Martinez had spent her career working on fusion reactors and antimatter containment systems, where a single mistake could vaporize entire space stations. She was accustomed to working with dangerous technology under extreme pressure, and the current situation was simply another engineering problem that needed to be solved quickly using whatever resources were available. Within hours of her first successful integration, human ships began sporting hybrid weapon systems that looked like mechanical nightmares but significantly increased their combat effectiveness. The weapons were crude and unreliable and had a tendency to explode without warning, but they could actually penetrate Kelhari shields under certain circumstances. Morrison stood in his command center, looking at tactical displays that showed a battle unlike anything in recorded military history. Human ships that had been cobbled together from mining equipment and civilian vessels were now carrying weapons that combined human engineering with alien technology in ways that violated every safety protocol ever written. His fleet looked like a collection of flying scrapyards held together by determination and improvised repairs, but they were actually winning individual engagements against enemy forces that should have been able to destroy them without effort. The key was that human tactics continued to evolve faster than Kelhari countermeasures could adapt to changing conditions. Lieutenant Amy Carter coordinated communication between scattered human forces using a mixture of traditional radio transmissions and alien communication devices that Martinez teams had reverse-engineered from captured equipment. The hybrid systems were unreliable and sometimes broadcast on frequencies that interfered with human navigation equipment, but they allowed coordination of complex multi-ship operations that the aliens had not expected. Zixthara realized that her fundamental assumptions about human capabilities had been completely wrong. She had evaluated them based on their technology and military organization without considering their adaptability and willingness to try unconventional solutions to tactical problems. The humans were not fighting like any species she had ever encountered because they were not trying to win through superior force or advanced technology. Instead, they were winning through sheer refusal to accept defeat and a terrifying ability to turn any situation to their advantage. When their weapons proved ineffective, they modified them with alien technology. When their ships were outgunned, they changed their tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses. When traditional boarding procedures failed, they invented new ones that violated every rule of civilized warfare. The Kelhari military doctrine was based on overwhelming technological superiority and the assumption that inferior species would recognize their helplessness and surrender when faced with impossible odds. The humans seemed to view impossible odds as simply another problem that could be solved through creative application of violence and engineering improvisation. Collins emerged from the wreckage of the alien destroyer with his squad intact and several containers of alien technology that Martinez teams could analyze and potentially integrate into human systems. His uniform was torn and his equipment was damaged, but he was already planning the next boarding operation against a Kelhari cruiser that had been disabled by concentrated human fire. Williams checked her remaining explosives and calculated how many more enemy ships she could gut before her supplies ran out. She had started the war as a demolitions expert trained for mining operations and had somehow become a specialist in alien ship destruction through practical experience gained during desperate combat operations. Zixthara found herself doing something she had never done in 40 cycles of military service. She was calling for reinforcements to deal with what should have been a routine conquest of a primitive species. The human resistance was not only continuing but was actually intensifying as they became more familiar with Kelhari technology and tactics. Admiral Richard Stone stood in the war room buried deep beneath the lunar surface and studied casualty reports that should have broken human morale completely. Humanity had lost 60% of its fleet during the first week of fighting yet. The remaining ships were actually more effective than they had been at the start of the conflict. The survivors had learned hard lessons through trial and error and were applying those lessons with deadly efficiency. Stone had commanded human forces during the asteroid wars and had seen what desperate soldiers could accomplish when fighting for their homes and families. But even he had been surprised by the transformation his forces had undergone during their first contact with alien military power. They had evolved from a scattered collection of national fleets into something that resembled a unified fighting force with a single purpose. Colonel Nancy Foster entered the war room carrying data tablets loaded with intelligence reports from across the solar system. Human forces had not only adapted alien shield technology, but were beginning to understand the fundamental principles behind Kelhari weapons and propulsion systems. What they were learning was being shared immediately across all surviving ships, rather than being hoarded by individual commanders or nations. Stone reviewed the reports and realized that humanity had been holding back during the initial phases of the conflict. The desperate defense of Earth had been a delaying action while human scientists and engineers studied their enemy and prepared countermeasures that could actually hurt Kelhari forces. Now they were ready to move from defensive operations to something that might actually be called a counterattack. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of his new command ship and marveled at what human ingenuity could accomplish when motivated by the prospect of extinction. His vessel had started life as a cargo hauler but was now armed with hybrid weapons, systems that combined the best aspects of human and alien technology. The ship looked like a mechanical nightmare, but it packed more firepower than anything humanity had possessed before the war. Morrison had lost his original ship during a boarding action 3 days earlier, but had immediately transferred to another vessel and continued fighting without missing a beat. His crew was a mixture of survivors from destroyed ships and volunteers who had never served in combat before the invasion. They worked together with the casual efficiency of people who knew that any mistake might mean the end of human civilization. Lieutenant Amy Carter worked at a communication station that had been rebuilt twice during the past week, as human engineers integrated alien technology with existing systems. She could now coordinate tactical operations across the entire solar system using a mixture of human radio transmissions and captured Kelhari communication devices that had been reverse-engineered by teams working around the clock. Carter had started the war as a simple communications officer, but had become something like a tactical coordinator for the entire human resistance. She tracked every ship movement and engagement throughout the solar system and could provide real-time intelligence to any commander who needed it. Her hybrid systems were unreliable and sometimes failed at critical moments, but they gave human forces a coordination capability they had never possessed before. Morrison led his strike force toward the Kelhari command ship with the confidence of someone who had learned that alien technology was not magic but simply engineering based on different principles. His squadron consisted of vessels that had been assembled from salvaged parts and held together by improvised repairs, but each ship was crewed by veterans who had survived a week of combat against impossible odds. The human fleet that approached. The Kelhari flagship bore no resemblance to the force that had first engaged alien invaders. These ships bristled with weapons that violated every safety protocol ever written and were crewed by soldiers who had learned to treat impossible situations as routine problems that could be solved through creative application of violence. Zixathara watched the approaching human force with growing unease that she tried to hide from her own crew. These were not the same primitive vessels that had engaged her forces at the beginning of the conflict. They had evolved and adapted and transformed their entire approach to warfare in less than 2 weeks of actual combat. The human ships moved with a coordination that suggested either perfect communication between commanders or an almost instinctive understanding of each other's tactical intentions. They approached from multiple directions simultaneously and used formations that forced Kelhari gunners to divide their attention between too many targets while preventing effective concentration of fire on any single human vessel. Morrison transmitted final instructions to his squadron using communication codes that Amy Carter had developed specifically for this operation. The humans had learned that Kelhari forces relied heavily on centralized command and control systems that could be disrupted if the right targets were hit with sufficient force. They were going to exploit this weakness with surgical precision while accepting casualties that would horrify any rational military commander. Commander Lisa Hayes brought her ship alongside Morrison vessel as the squadron prepared for its final approach to the alien command ship. Her destroyer had been rebuilt 3 times during the past week and now carried weapons that her original designers never could have imagined. She commanded a crew of survivors who had learned to function as a team despite coming from different ships and different nations. Hayes understood that this battle was about more than just defending Earth from alien invasion. They were fighting to prove to themselves and to the galaxy that humanity would not go quietly into extinction. Every ship they destroyed and every small victory they achieved was a message to anyone who might be watching that some species could not be conquered through superior technology alone. The Kelhari had made the mistake of assuming that technological superiority automatically translated into military victory. They had not considered that an inferior force might be willing to accept casualties and make sacrifices that would allow them to overcome their disadvantages through sheer determination and tactical innovation. Stone monitored the progress of Morrison's strike force from his command center and felt something that might have been pride in what his species had accomplished during 2 weeks of desperate fighting. Humanity had not simply survived contact with a superior alien civilization. They had learned and adapted and evolved into something that could actually threaten forces that had conquered dozens of other worlds. The war was far from over, and the outcome was still very much in doubt, but humanity had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that technological advancement was not the only measure of a species' military potential, and that some forces in the universe could not be defeated through conventional means alone. Zixthara felt her command ship shudder under concentrated human weapons fire, and finally understood what she was truly facing. This was not simply another primitive species that could be overwhelmed through superior technology and firepower. These were beings who turned adversity into strength and treated impossible odds as merely another engineering problem that could be solved through determination and creative thinking. Commander Lisa Hayes refused evacuation orders, even though her ship was a flying wreck held together by emergency welds and the stubborn determination of her crew. The Defiance had been rebuilt so many times during the past 2 weeks that almost nothing remained of the original vessel except the name, painted on what was left of the hull. Hayes stood on a bridge that leaked atmosphere through a dozen temporary patches and manually targeted alien weak points that her crew had identified through painful trial and error. Hayes had lost half her original crew during the fighting, but the survivors had been replaced by volunteers from destroyed ships who brought their own hard-won experience to her command. They worked together with the efficiency of people who had learned that every second of hesitation might mean the difference between victory and extinction. Her weapons officer was a former cargo pilot who had never fired a shot in anger before the invasion, but could now hit targets that professional gunners would have considered impossible. The humans did not fight like any species Zixthara had encountered during her long military career. They did not retreat when outgunned or surrender when outmatched or despair when facing annihilation. Instead, they improvised and adapted and overcame through sheer force of will, combined with a terrifying willingness to sacrifice anything necessary to achieve their objectives. Captain Morrison boarding teams had infiltrated the Kelhari command vessel through breaches blasted in the hull by concentrated human fire. Instead of trying to capture the ship intact so it could be studied and reverse-engineered, the humans were systematically destroying every critical system while fighting room by room through corridors designed for beings twice their size. Morrison led the assault personally, because he had learned that human forces fought most effectively when their commanders shared the same risks as ordinary soldiers. He carried the same weapons and wore the same armor as his Marines, while coordinating the attack through a communication system that Kate Williams had jury-rigged from alien components and human radio equipment. Sergeant Kate Williams worked her way toward the alien central computer core with methodical precision that came from years of experience with controlled demolitions in dangerous environments. She planted charges throughout the ship, critical systems, not to disable them temporarily, but to ensure they could never be repaired or used against human forces in the future. Williams had started the war as a mining engineer who understood how to use explosives to reshape asteroid ore into useful materials. She had somehow become a specialist in alien ship destruction through practical experience gained during desperate boarding actions, where failure meant not just personal death, but the possible extinction of her entire species. Zix Thara realized, with growing horror, that the humans were not trying to defeat her fleet through conventional military victory. They were willing to destroy both fleets rather than accept conquest because their definition of success was simply ensuring that their enemies could not claim victory. They would rather see everything burn than allow themselves to be enslaved or absorbed into an alien empire. Dr. Rachel Martinez had reverse-engineered enough alien technology to give humanity a fighting chance in direct combat, but more importantly, she had identified critical weaknesses in Kelhari designs that could be exploited by forces willing to take extreme risks. Her hybrid weapon systems were crude and dangerous and had a tendency to explode without warning, but they could actually penetrate alien shields under the right circumstances. Martinez worked in a laboratory that had been hit by enemy fire twice during the past week, but continued functioning because human engineers had learned to build redundancy into every critical system. She understood that her improvised technology was killing almost as many humans as aliens, but also knew that conventional weapons were completely useless against Kelhari defenses. The humans had weaponized their own unpredictability and turned their chaotic nature into a strategic advantage that alien commanders could not counter effectively. Where other species would spend months planning careful campaigns based on detailed intelligence analysis, the humans were adapting their tactics in real time based on immediate battlefield experience. Morrison coordinated the assault on the alien command ship while fighting hand-to-hand combat in corridors that had never been designed for boarding actions. His communication system allowed him to direct operations throughout the ship while dodging alien weapons fire and dealing with environmental hazards that could kill him in dozens of different ways. The boarding action was succeeding not because human forces were superior to alien defenders, but because they were willing to accept casualties and take risks that no rational military commander would ever authorize. They fought with the desperate efficiency of people who knew that retreat was not an option and that failure meant the end of everything they cared about. Amy Carter maintained communication links between scattered human forces throughout the solar system while coordinating the complex tactical operations that were slowly grinding down Kelhari resistance. Her hybrid systems were unreliable and frequently failed at critical moments, but they allowed human commanders to work together in ways that alien forces had not anticipated. Carter had learned to function on 3 hours of sleep while managing communication traffic between dozens of ships operating across millions of kilometers of space. She tracked every engagement and coordinated support operations while dealing with equipment that had been built from salvaged parts and held together by determination rather than proper engineering. Zix Thara watched her tactical displays as human forces systematically dismantled her fleet through tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare she had ever learned. The humans were not trying to capture alien technology or territory or resources. They were simply ensuring that the Kelhari invasion could not succeed regardless of what it cost them in ships and lives. The realization that struck Zix Thara with the force of a physical blow was that humanity possessed something far more dangerous than superior technology or tactical skill. They possessed an absolute refusal to accept defeat, combined with the ability to transform any disadvantage into an opportunity for innovation and adaptation. Williams reached the alien computer core and began placing charges with the casual efficiency of someone who had spent her entire adult life working with dangerous explosives in hostile environments. She was not trying to capture alien data or technology for human use. She was ensuring that the Kelhari command ship would never threaten anyone again, even if it meant her own death in the process. The battle ended not with humanity's surrender, but with Zix Thara fleet in full retreat from a solar system they had expected to conquer in a matter of days. For the first time in Kelhari imperial history, a primitive species had not only resisted conquest, but had inflicted such devastating losses that continued fighting would have resulted in the complete destruction of both fleets. Zixthara stood in her damaged command center and reviewed tactical records that documented something unprecedented in galactic military history. An inferior force had defeated superior technology through sheer determination and an ability to adapt faster than their enemies could respond to changing battlefield conditions. The humans had transformed themselves from helpless victims into something that resembled a military threat in less than 3 weeks of actual combat. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of his battered command ship and looked out at a debris field that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. What remained of 2 fleets drifted in the darkness, as testament to the cost of first contact between species that had never learned to coexist peacefully. Earth had survived, but at a price that would be felt for generations to come. Morrison. Crew worked around him to restore basic ship functions while monitoring communication channels for any sign that the alien retreat might be a tactical deception rather than genuine withdrawal. They had learned during 3 weeks of desperate fighting that their enemies were capable of sophisticated deception and that victory could turn into defeat in a matter of minutes if they allowed themselves to become overconfident. Lieutenant. Amy Carter reported that they were receiving transmissions from across the galaxy as news of the human victory spread through interstellar communication networks. Other species wanted to know how a primitive civilization had managed to defeat the seemingly invincible Kelhari Imperial fleet. The answer was not simple technology transfer or tactical innovation, but something far more fundamental. Morrison realized that humanity had not simply won a military victory against superior forces. They had announced to the galaxy that some species possessed qualities that could not be measured in terms of technological advancement or industrial capacity. They had proven that determination and adaptability could overcome advantages that should have made resistance impossible. Admiral Richard Stone addressed the survivors of Earth Defense Forces from his command center beneath the lunar surface. The men and women who had fought in humanity's first interstellar war looked like veterans of a conflict that had lasted years rather than weeks. They had aged in ways that could not be measured in simple time and had learned lessons that would shape human military doctrine for centuries to come. Stone understood that the war had changed humanity in fundamental ways that went beyond simple technological advancement or tactical experience. They had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed and had proven to themselves that they could survive contact with forces that should have been capable of destroying them without effort. Colonel Nancy Foster reviewed after-action reports from across the solar system and documented innovations that had emerged during the fighting. Human forces had developed new forms of coordination that did not rely on traditional command structures and had learned to function effectively even when facing communication breakdowns and equipment failures that would have paralyzed more conventional military organizations. Foster realized that humanity had not simply defended Earth from alien invasion. They had evolved into something new during the course of the fighting and had demonstrated capabilities that would make future enemies think twice before attempting conquest. The galaxy had been put on notice that some species could not be defeated through conventional military superiority alone. Zixthara transmitted a final message to Earth before her fleet disappeared into hyperspace for the long journey back to Kelhari space. It was not a threat or a promise of future invasion, but a warning to the rest of the galaxy about what they had encountered in this remote solar system. Her message would be studied by military analysts across dozens of civilizations as they tried to understand what had happened during the failed Earth conquest. The message was simple and direct. Zixthara had fought against hundreds of species across thousands of worlds during her military career, but had never encountered anything like human resistance. She warned that humanity possessed something that could not be defeated through superior firepower or advanced technology. They had demonstrated a refusal to yield that transformed apparent weakness into genuine strength. Morrison watched the alien fleet disappear from his sensors and felt something that might have been relief mixed with exhaustion and a grim satisfaction that came from surviving impossible odds. His ship and his crew had been tested in ways that no amount of peacetime training could have prepared them for, and had proven equal to challenges that should have destroyed them. The war was over, but Morrison understood that this was only the beginning of humanity interaction with a galaxy full of species that might view Earth as either a potential ally or a threat to be eliminated before it could become too dangerous. The next few years would determine whether first contact would lead to peaceful cooperation or to conflicts that would make the Kelhari invasion look like a minor border skirmish. Dr. Rachel Martinez stood in her ruined laboratory surrounded by hybrid technology that represented months of desperate improvisation under impossible conditions. Her work had helped save human civilization, but she understood that the real victory had not come from superior engineering or clever tactical innovations. It had come from the willingness of ordinary people to keep fighting when any rational analysis suggested that resistance was hopeless. Sergeant Kate Williams emerged from the wreckage of the Kelhari command ship with her demolition work complete and the alien vessel reduced to scrap metal that would never threaten anyone again. She had started the war as a mining engineer and had somehow become a specialist in alien ship destruction through practical experience gained during boarding actions that violated every rule of civilized warfare. The Kelhari Empire marked human space as permanently off-limits not because humanity possessed superior military technology, but because they had demonstrated something far more dangerous. They had shown that some species possessed the ability to make conquest itself a victory so costly that it became meaningless to achieve. The galaxy learned that humanity would not go quietly into extinction, and that any force attempting to conquer Earth would pay a price so terrible that success would be indistinguishable from failure. The humans had not simply defeated an alien invasion. They had announced their presence to the universe in terms that every species could understand, regardless of their technology or military capabilities. Morrison's final report to Earth Command was simple and direct. Humanity had survived first contact with hostile alien forces and had proven that they possessed qualities that could not be measured in terms of ships or weapons or industrial capacity. They had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in their technology, but in their absolute refusal to accept defeat when fighting for everything they cared about.